My name, for those who don't know me, my name is Elia Tapia, and I will be moderating this discussion along with my forum colleague, Gabriela Rendon. And
Hi.
we welcome, hi Gabby, and
Oh,
we would like to welcome the speakers of today.
sorry.
There you go.
Yeah. So we start with Saul. Elia?
Okay, so Saul, he's a civil engineer with a master's degree and a PhD on water resources at UNAM. He has been working on water resources evaluation and dry and tropical environments under human and climate alterations, as well as the analysis of the water energy nexus, floods and droughts. Saul's research interests include hydrological modeling, groundwater modeling, application of remote sensing for water management, programming, geoinformatics, and data science. So it doesn't say in here, but Saul is member of the executive committee of the Permanent Forum of Binational Water. So yay! And now he's gonna present his valuable work to us.
Welcome, Saul.
Bravo.
So we continue with Laura. Laura Rodriguez. Laura Rodriguez Lozada is currently working on the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program to integrate research and data on transboundary aquifers between Mexico and Texas. Laura is also pursuing a master's degree through Texas A&M University's Water Management and Hydrological Science program. Her research interests include groundwater modeling, groundwater contaminating transport, geophysical methods, and remote sensors applied to hydrogeology. Prior to coming to Texas A&M, she received her Bachelor of Science degree in geology from National University of Colombia and worked as a geophysicist for oil and gas companies. Welcome, Laura. Wow. Now we continue with Randall Hanson.
So Randall Hanson, he is president hydrologist of One Water Hydrologic. He's a fifth generation Californian working on the frontera for over 40 years, consulting and as lead USGS research hydrologist, developing hydrologic methods and water supply analysis of regional watersheds nationally and internationally. As a co-developer, he is also helping others with climate change analysis and use newest USGS mod flow called One Water for their food and water security analysis of conjunctive use, climate change, and sustainability and adaptation. So we told you that we will be having three great scientists. We weren't lying. And well, thank you so much, Saul, Laura, and Randall for being here. So we have an agenda for the day. These are some of the questions that they will be answering to us during these hours or what we have left of the hour. First of all, we would like to know what does your model attempt to represent and what are the questions you're trying to respond. Also, number two, what are the implications of this type of information to your field and for binational collaboration? Number three, what are the lessons learned and remaining data gaps? And of course, we will have a questions and Q&A questions from the public. If you have a question, you can type it on the chat. We will retrieve it and say it out loud so that our members can answer. If it's specific for someone, you just type these questions for Laura and then the question, and we will just send the message.
I'd like to say each participant will have in total 10 minutes to answer. That is more or less 4 minutes per answer, per question. So keep that in mind, please. So let's start.
Okay, so we are going to start with Saul. Saul, we would like to know What does your model attempt to represent? And what are the questions you are trying to respond?
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Mhm.
Yes, James, please go ahead.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Elia, for the invitation. And thank you very much to all of the members of the Permanent Forum for inviting me to participate in this subject. I'm always very interested in this subject, and especially I'm excited about being on the same session with Laura and Randy, as I admire their work so much. So without further ado, I'll just move forward with the presentation and we'll go to the next slide. Just to respond a little to the first question, I would like to first clarify several things. One is that I'll be talking mostly about a specific case we worked on for hydrological modeling in Costa Rica. This work, I believe, best synthesizes my research in terms of the use of hydrological modeling and the evaluation of the data for hydrological resources. So first, just to give us some general context, I think most of us know this. We know that in Latin America and in Mexico as well, of course, there is a lack of sufficient data to properly evaluate the hydrological resources. So here we have a graph of how the rain gauges have varied in Costa Rica. We have a similar tendency in Mexico with the rain gauge stations from the 70s. And so this lack of data especially affects those of us who work with this data for modeling and for decision making. So without the proper data, we cannot do hydrological modeling with sufficient integration and in the watersheds. So especially in terms of Latin America, since the information and the data is sparse, the quality of the information tends to be very questionable, as the little information that exists is not of good enough quality to interpret it for different applications. And this lack of data does not only affect the simulations, but it also affects our general knowledge for developing new models and new theories, since we need more information to analyze these trends. So we use remote detection technology. And we'll move to the next slide, please. I would like to talk about this model that we've been developing in Costa Rica. It's been used in Costa Rica. And one of the things we're working on is what the limitations are for remote sensing. As we see in Costa Rica is climatologically and topographically a very complex region. And the model was assembled using remote sensing data with some so there's some calibration of the data, but basically the data has been derived from remote sensing, and it's been applied on a national scale. And it also has transborder implications. Next slide, please. Now, another question we're trying to answer in our study is how can we deal with the problems related to remote sensing? There are errors related to this technology. So we're trying to see what kinds of errors are generated when we use these stations and these remote sensing. And sometimes we can detect these errors when we see unexpected results. And we still, even with these problems, we have access to much more information with the remote sensing data that allows us to better understand the hydrological resources and to answer the questions we seek. Yes. Yes, okay, and so the questions will wait to the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Saul. That was very interesting. I like to say that even though your work is not about the US-Mexico border region, I think it's very valuable because it provides comparative information that can be useful for analyze different situations or cases, such as you say the lack of data, problems with climatological records. I think those are issues, common issues in every context. Don't you think, Elia?
Yes, definitely, Gabi and Saul. There are obviously common difficulties that you face in the majority of the projects in Latin America. So seeing and talking about possible options to face these difficulties, which include the use of remote sensing, well, it's really helpful for those who would like to pursue projects in Latin America, projects in the US-Mexico border. So thank you, Saul, for your contribution. Now we're going to let Laura talk about his modeling efforts. So Laura, can you please talk about your model and what is that you've been doing lately?
Hello, everybody. Thanks to the Permanent Forum for the invitation. My name is Laura Rodriguez from Texas A&M University. What I'm going to present here is the work of my master. Right now, I'm pursuing my PhD, also in water management at Texas A&M University. So here, this project, we use numerical model combined with remote sensors. And well, it was the transboundary nature of the Allende Piedras Negras aquifer using a numerical model approach. I will use the acronym APN for the Allende Piedras Negras aquifer just to go a little bit faster. About the first question, the main purpose of this model was to evaluate, oh, sorry, next, I forgot. It was to evaluate if the APN aquifer was transboundary by building a numerical model. But first of all, I would like to clarify what kind of aquifer we're talking about here. Rivera, in his publication of 2015, explained that there were 4 main cases of the presence or absence of transboundary flow. And the APN aquifer is similar to his 3rd case, where we have a river that matches with the political border, but there is no apparent groundwater flow, even if there is geological continuity. However, anthropologic activities can modify the transboundary flow mainly by extracting the groundwater through pumping wells. And some of the effects of excessive pumping are the depletion of groundwater levels and the base flow reduction in the river, surface water volumes reduction, which eventually would impact the water allocation obligations from water treaties like the 1944 water treaty. And if we have excessive pumping in one of the countries, instead of having the groundwater flows converging in the river, they will converge somewhere else, turning the system in a transboundary groundwater flow. So for some of you that maybe are not familiar, we are going to go with where is the aquifer. Next, please. So the APN aquifer is located near the Gulf of Mexico between the states of Coahuila and Texas. This is an unconfined aquifer that is crossed by the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo, and there is a strong connection between the aquifer and the river. The population in this area is near 300,000, and 85% of the water of this region comes from groundwater. Next, please. Okay, there are 3 conditions that Rivera mentioned in his publication that we need to have a transboundary groundwater flow system. One of them is the geological continuity, which we have. The pumping wells near the international border, which we also have. But now, are the users of these wells pumping enough to modify the groundwater flow patterns? So that's when we thought we really need to build a numerical model to answer that particular question. So we use remote sensors as well as in situ measurements to start building the model. For remote sensors, we have evapotranspiration from GEODAS and precipitation from TRMM. Both data sets are in a monthly basis for 18 years, and both were downloaded from the NASA website. Other information that we used was geology, river stages, observation, pumping wells, and hydraulic conductivity, specific storage, and porosity. Then we build the conceptual model. It's the figure that you're seeing below. Here we can show how the water is moving in the whole system, but at the end, we don't really know the quantities. So we proceeded with the numerical model. Next, please. So to the question that I mentioned before, do we have a transboundary groundwater flow system? So yes, definitely. One thing that we found with our model is that it depends on how close the wells are to the river and how much water they are going to pump. On the two top cross sections, we have the case of no wells. So in the cross section A, we have that the groundwater flows converge on the river, which is the political border 2. And on the cross section B, we have that the river is recharging the aquifer and the flow almost divides in half to each side of the aquifer. But the cross sections C and D show the case where you locate a well in one side of the river. In these cases, the flow convergence zone will move to the side where the well is located and you will have a transboundary flow system. We also found that pumping can induce flow through, which is the discharge of the aquifer in the river and then the recharge of the aquifer again, but in the other side of the aquifer. In other words, at first your water is groundwater, then surface water, and then groundwater again. And this dynamic is induced by pumping in the case of the APN aquifer. Also, according to our simulation of 18 years, we found that we had an average drawdown of 0.76 meters, but in some areas, this drawdown was of more than 14 meters. So it's almost 1 meter per year. I think that covers the first question.
Okay, well, thank you, Laura, for your answer. This is really interesting. I get excited every time I see people doing science within the US-Mexico border, particularly modeling work, because these efforts, they help to improve knowledge in a region where information sometimes is not that easily available. So bravo for science in the border region, and also thank you for sharing this with us today.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to move to Randy. Can you please explain us about your modeling efforts, please?
Okay, thanks so much for having me. And what I wanted to kind of go over is show just some remote sensing. It's in support of what we do, which is integrated hydrologic modeling and related conjunctive use analysis. So that's my dabbling of examples. So if we go to the next slide, please. So for the first question, I want to fundamentally affirm, as did the other two speakers, with their great presentations, that yes, model codes like what we're doing really need remotely sensed data, both for model input and model observations. We simulate some things that you can get from remotely sensed data, but we actually simulate it, and that gives our models the power to not only match the past and the present, but also to be used to do more skillful simulations of the future. But basically, we're looking at development, sustainability, adaptation, mitigation, climate change, variability, connectivities. We still not only want to use models for estimating the actual outcomes or potential predictions, but also the causational relation between the climate, the land, the surface water, and the groundwater. And then this is a big thing, especially in California, but I think in the transboundary areas as well, like we're seeing in the Lower Rio Grande, is the secondary effects, whether it be directly or indirectly, water is moving as land and water use are changing. So that's a big thing as well. Next slide, please. So in the context of what we look at, and especially in California, and this is actually a diagram from the Department of Water Resources that they use for their concept of budgeting systems, is really we have the atmosphere, climate, we have a surface water system, we have a land surface system, and then a groundwater system. And so really we're looking at many more budgets and ways of that we need to connect all this. And remotely sensed data is a big part of this, but what we don't want to do is confuse complete with complex. So we have many elements and layers here, but they all complement each other and can take advantage of remotely sensed data. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we have for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California is that they have these, what I call the 6 deadly sins, but it's basically these are the undesirable secondary effects: groundwater declines, storage depletion, seawater intrusion, water quality degradation, land subsidence, and groundwater surface water interaction that actually interfere with surface water flows. There's a lot of other things that can also be an effect, and we try to get at these as well. And that includes climate change, hardening demand, ecology, alternate water sources, mitigation, both supply and demand management, as well as water quality and governance, and reservoir operating rules, and how to really make deliveries to everyone. Next slide, please. And so to be more specific, we can get some of these things that some of the other speakers have already mentioned. We can get climate from regional or radar. We can get ET, both the potential and actual ET, from a variety of methods from Landsat and MODIS. We can do land system information, including things that we use to actually simulate ET through the land use processes of the farm process. So we have land use and crop coefficients and fractions of canopy and soil moisture and whatnot. And then also for the surface water flow and conveyance, we can get wet dry maps and perennial reaches. In groundwater, we can look at land subsidence with INSAR and point INSAR, and also kinematic GPS, groundwater storage, depletion with GRACE, and so on, LIDAR for topography, transient EM for geology, and also INSAR for faults. Next slide, please. And this is just an example. I always want to show a couple examples. It's a valley. It's not a transboundary valley, and it's here in California, but on the left is a map of actual ET using the metric method from April through September. And then what we would actually do then is to overlay our groundwater water balance subregions, our accounting units. They're shown on the right, and we could sum that up on a monthly basis and create simulated observations for our ability to simulate ET. We can also, if we have measured pumpage, we can compare against that as well, but that just gives you an example of how we can do that. Next slide, please. And then here we're looking at something that maybe many people don't realize is a problem, but if you have anything more than 100 feet of water level decline, 30 meters, in many alluvial basins, that you're starting to look at land subsidence. So anywhere from 100 to 300 feet of water level decline. This is a groundwater basin in Central California, and here we actually have INSAR, which is what you're seeing on the right, the colored map on the right, and then surrounding it are various time series of measured and simulated land subsides, and we've used both point INSAR, where we're using stable points of INSAR, and then the upper gray one and the lower right gray one are the PBO stations. So we actually had 2 plate boundary observatory stations in the valley here, so that was really something that's was helpful here. We can actually see with great detail. Not only do we have PBO stations in the adjacent mountains, so we know the plate is moving to the northwest at 2.5 centimeters a year, but we could also see the sinkage from groundwater pumpage. So it's just another example. You can also see some truncation in the INSAR image, even though there's a lot of agriculture which decorrelates INSAR, but that's part of that. So I think that might be it. One more slide. Or is that might be it?
Yeah, I think that is the last one in this part.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Randall.
Thank you, Randall, for your answer. Oh boy, with those secondary effects you were talking about. It is good to see that there are remote sensing tools that can help you obtain the information that is needed for your modeling efforts. I invited some of my remote sensing students from Unison today. I hope they are paying attention. And yes, you can get all of this data from remote sensing. So yay, I want you to all do your homework well. Okay, well, that was the first round for question number one. We're gonna switch to the next question. Gabi, can you please help me here?
Okay, wait a second. Something happened. Something happened, wait a second. Okay, here we are. Okay, we're having a lot of troubles today. So let's keep going to the next question. So, Saul, what do you think that are the implications of this type of information to your field and for binational collaboration? Can you explain for us?
Very good. Thank you very much. And I would like to begin my response to this question with a quote from George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. This applies for statistical models, but I think it also applies for models that try to show something physical. It's difficult to achieve a model that can reproduce all of the parameters and things that may occur. But I think we have models that can reproduce certain components that can be useful for us. So I'll talk a little more about this surface water modeling and with some other components. And in terms of surface water modeling, in most cases, stream flow information is used to analyze the data to get the parameters. As we've seen in the other examples, the stream flow data is trying to force the model to reproduce something that we can see in the hydrological cycle. But there are other issues beyond the hydrological cycle. So perhaps with other combinations of parameters, we can see other things, and perhaps we will also have other complications with our model. And it's working with the variables that we're trying to collaborate, but we do have some complications. So the remote sensing data have been used a lot over the last few years to calibrate our models and to add some additional components to them that allow us to limit the fields of parameters that we can estimate. So this way we can have models that are a little more balanced, that are able to show different components of the hydrological cycle and not just one. And we could have models that could be used for better evaluation and decision making, and not for just a one variable that the model has been developed for, but for other variables as well. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, with regard to remote sensing data for binational collaboration, yes, it is possible. And remote sensing data allow us or give us additional benefits that we can make use of. Remote sensing data is really borderless, and some data that has been collected by satellites and by remote sensing have been also calibrated with the local meters and collection sites. And so this has allowed us to calibrate the data and get better results. In some Latin American countries, of course, there's a scarcity of information. And so this remote sensing there is very important, but we must be careful with how we work with it. Another benefit we get from remote sensing is that it provides continuous information in a space of time, and it gives all of us the same access to the information. So this is something that can be useful for transborder collaboration, where perhaps the neighboring country doesn't have the same capital resources to invest in conventional data collection methods. Remote sensing allows the ability to collect this information. However, one of the complications that we should point out is that it does require a little more advanced technical knowledge. Uh, and so we'll address that question in my next intervention. And this concludes my response to this question.
Thank you, Saul. That was very interesting. I agree totally with you. Um, um, so what about you, Lara? What do you think about the implications of the information to your field and binational collaboration?
Well, to answer this question, previous studies focused on the Mexican side of the aquifer, and only one author tried to include the Texas region, but the information was really scarce at that time. And this previous studies stopped in the border, and it was like the aquifer stopped there too. But we have to take into account what's happening on the other side of the border, since any actions of our neighbor are going to have an impact on our lands. So we really need to do the whole aquifer. And since we had enough information after the year 2000, and we wanted to know if the aquifer was transboundary, we started to build our model to see the whole picture. We use remote sensors also because they mostly don't have boundaries, most of them. And you can see the whole area, no matter if there are boundaries. And also they help us cover areas with lack of information on both sides of the border, because we had some big gaps, like in area in the southern region of the aquifer. These kind of models are very useful with the decision-making process. For example, policymakers can just put an arbitrary cap in the volumes of water extracted. Here I'm talking mostly about the results of the model. So let's say, what if someone says you can pump 10,000 cubic meters per day, when according to the model you can barely pump 1,000 cubic meters per day. So that gives us an idea of what are the capabilities of the aquifer. And the models can work the other way too. So what if we have a person that asks, why are we pumping only 1,000 cubic meters per day if that's not enough for this area that has lack of water? To 10,000. But we can say, hey, we have this study, and physically you cannot pump more than this. And we have this, we have to follow them because there is not enough water there. So our scientific studies can work as a decision support tool. I think that answers my second question.
Thank you, Lara. Yes, totally. Science could and should support any making and policy process that we attempt to do, especially in a binational context. So yeah, you're right. Let's continue with Randall. Same question, Randall. Please.
Good to go. Yeah. So, what are the implications of this type of information? And I'm just listing four major kind of topics here. They're very helpful for us in creating both input and observations. Uh, it really allows analyzing for all the different elements as we showed before. And that then we really have a need for that fundamental data and derivatives of fundamental data. We don't pre-calculate a lot of stuff. So remotely sensed data, even though we're typically calculating from that, it can be used in straight away. It's not helpful if this does not span both sides of the border, and that's been a big issue. The only data set I'm familiar with that does is the USGS Binational Environmental Health Initiative that spans a buffer of about 100 kilometers on each side, but that may not span all watersheds. It's not helpful if not supplemented with ground data, and Sal brought this up in his first presentation, and I totally agree that many of these things require rescaling and whatnot from the remotely sensed data, and that's both examples are climate and land use data. It's really helpful in supporting self-updating models, and hopefully we're getting to the point where we'll have land-based information systems that we'll call smart valleys, like we have a smart house or a smart city, and remote sensing is going to be a part of that. But a lot of the remotely sensed sites also don't facilitate automated repeat retrieval. So if you know what tiles you want of certain types of data, whatnot, that you could just send some kind of a data chimp to go get it in the dead of night, as opposed to having to go there yourself. So that's something else we're looking at. Next slide, please. So, and again, I brought this up in previously, but I think that the Rio Yaqui is a great example of in Mexico of where this has already started, where they've got the land-based system and some telemetry and whatnot going on to really have a smart watershed and a smart valley. And this is a fundamental piece of it. Remotely sensed data is a piece of this network and complements it. So that was pretty much all I wanted to say on that. Thanks.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Randy. So let's move to the last question. Elia, can you take care of the last? Elia, can you hear me?
Sorry. Okay, so our third question is, what are the lessons learned and remaining gaps of your studies? We don't have much time left. We're gonna try to finish this round of questions, and for those that want to stay with us and keep asking questions for the questions from the public to the speakers, we will be happy to stay here, but we know that some of you have to go, so thank you so much for being here if I don't see you. All right, so first of all, we're gonna go with Saul. Can you tell us about your lessons learned and remaining gaps?
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to be brief. I think one of the main gaps that we've had in this case is when you're using these very complex models, is those of us that work directly with this type of information. Well, it is not too hard, not too difficult to manipulate and to use this. And for the general public, or for those that the decision making people, so we can use this information, use this data. So I think that what's been missing and what we're still missing is to make this information even more available to the public in general. So in a general way, this is a project that we developed in Costa Rica, and we had an additional component additionally to the model and to additionally to generating results for academic purposes. We in the end were able to build a platform so that we were able to visualize and consult information directly from the internet. We could do it, and this is a platform that ended up being documented, and it was made available to a non-specialized public so that they could interpret this information themselves. So in terms of the remote sensing data, Well, I think every year we have new and new products with a lot of improvements, both in resolution, spatial and temporal resolution. And I think in that regard, there is not much left to do. The institutions in charge of generating new data, they do a great job. So for those of us who are really using the information or directly applying this information, we have to find the practical application to this data. So we have to remember this remote sensing and all these models are very good, but at the end of the day, they're just a tool. So we have to take it into account that you have to use this information, and we have to decide how we're going to use it for what purpose, and we need to try to make sure that our information, the information that we generate, is available to the public in general, and especially for those people, the decision makers. And at the same time, it's important that those that make the decisions, they need to take into account this remote sensing data as one more source of information that they can use, so that they can use it for management and resource management. And I think in Mexico, they're already considering adding the 011, maybe something else, adding information to the use of remote sensing in Mexico, and they need to give it to the people as an additional step, so people can accept and use this kind of information as available data that they have, perhaps not official data, but as an additional source of information, something that you can use and you can apply, and that lets you obtain additional information. Just to finish up, I would like to say that it is necessary to generate on top of the already existing data, the information that we have. Those of us that already work with model, we need to make sure that we make it more available, more easily accessible for the public in general. And that's all that I wanted to say.
Thank you so much for your answer. Can we go with Laura next, please?
Well, definitely, I learned a lot of things from this study. I use the remote sensors as an alternative to incomplete data sets from weather stations, or as an alternative of no information at all. What I mean is, for example, with evapotranspiration, you need a big tower, and for our project, the closest tower was in San Antonio, which is too far from our area of interest and wouldn't be representative. And at the end, we use the GILDAS to get evapotranspiration. Here on the left, we have the weather stations in the area. And as you can see, there are some areas with good aerial coverage, but there are some areas that don't have any. And from all of these stations, we selected the most complete precipitation records, which were these 3 points near the international border. We didn't use other stations because they had missing information for days and in some cases for months. And we couldn't work with gaps in precipitation since this is the main source of recharge of the APN aquifer, so we used TRMM data. We also wanted to know how close was the precipitation from remote sensors to the precipitation from weather stations. And on the right, you can see the 3 weather stations with better records and the comparison with the remote sensor data, with an R squared of 0.75 in the best case, which is not bad, at least for me. Next, please. I made a very simple table. I know there are more pros and cons, but here we have a very short list. One of the main advantages is that remote sensors are free. Any of you can access them through the NASA website, and this is a huge advantage for nations with limited access to weather stations, or if you have limited funding and you cannot get information, you can go to NASA and download the products for free. As we mentioned before, there are some parameters that aren't captured by the weather stations, but you can extract them from the remote sensors. For example, evapotranspiration, and from GILDAS, or another one that comes to my mind is soil moisture from MODIS. The remote sensors have and almost no gaps in the record. That's a big advantage. You can also find records from hours to months, and sometimes you can even use the remote sensors to fill the gaps in the weather stations to do something like a hybrid data set. But not everything is perfect. So you have low spatial resolution. If you zoom in a lot, you might have a pixel product and you don't really know what's happening there. So remote sensors sometimes are not suitable for small areas. And if you decided to use remote sensors in a small area, you will need to do downscaling, which is not easy and involves extra steps in the process. Another issue that you might have with remote sensors is how far in the past you need to go. What I mean is that the first remote sensor was Landsat 1, which was deployed on 1972. And Landsat is good for land use, but not for precipitation, or for example, GRACE, which is very common for groundwater studies, but the products go back only until 2002. And this is very important if you are going to do a study in climate change, where you need to see records of at least 30, 40 years, at least. The remote sensors are not going to go too far in the past. And in that case, the weather stations are better, since you can have records even since the 19th century. Another thing that we definitely need to learn as scientists is how we present our information. Because there are some reports where you have the table, but it's easy to target highs and lows in plots or maps. For example, here I added a simple table, but it's much easier to find the greatest temperature in the plot rather than the table. I also think that policymakers have to analyze not only our scientific information, but also social, economic, management information. It's a lot. And everything in a very short time. So if we really want them to see our results, just make them simple and very straightforward. Another point is our language, because sometimes we use our jargon and people without our scientific background will understand half of it if we're lucky. So we really need to learn how to explain our projects in plain language. I still struggle a lot with that, and I practice with friends that don't have that scientific background to see if I'm clear, but it's a work in progress. One challenging aspect that we found in this project was the data accessibility in Mexico, because we had to ask almost each person independently for what they had, and that's such a time-consuming task. In Texas, it's almost centralized, so we didn't have big difficulties in Texas about that. Also, sometimes when we found the information in Mexico, it wasn't useful because, for example, I had a lot of wells in my area of study, but some of them only had coordinates, but nothing about depth or the volumes of water extracted, so I couldn't use them. Some people say that the difference in units is a major issue, since we work with metric system in Mexico and imperial system in the United States, but that wasn't a real issue for me because the conversions are standardized and you just multiply by a factor and that's it. But the really challenging issue was working with different geological units in each country, because in this model, the geology was very simple and we could even follow the boundaries of the aquifer and remote sensors. But in other publications that we've been working on with Rosario Sanchez, when I tried to match the geology from Mexico and from the United States, those maps didn't match at all. And I had to search for geologic descriptions to find the geologic correlations in each country. I also used remote sensors to find geologic trends and continuity of the units, but this geology part was the task that took most of the time in other projects that we did on the border. I think that answers that third question.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for your answer. There's always going to be pros and cons when we are modeling specific areas. Of course, simplification of scientific language is definitely useful as well. Well, the harmonization of the measurement units, it's true. It's like just make sure that you're not mixing things, but you will fix it with Excel. So that's fine. Also, I've seen how the geologic maps of the border region looks. And I do have a geologic background. So when you see them, it's like, okay, so there's a big fault zone in there because what's on top, it doesn't match with what it is below. So yeah, some things that we need to take into account when we are modeling these areas. Thank you so much for your contribution. And now we're gonna go with Randall. Can you please talk about your lessons learned and remaining gaps?
Great, thanks. Again, I just kind of have a bullet list here, but really lessons learned is really get help and expand your team. You can't be a specialist at everything is the number one lesson. But inside of that, remotely sensed data from most websites require all kinds of special processing and are typically not set up for automated retrievals. I think that's these are lessons learned. Large data sets can be difficult to pass over the internet. Sometimes we still actually mail hard drives, especially for the climate change runs that we do. And then land use and crop and stream network data really requires additional QA/QC, and some things like annual land use just aren't adequate for things like rotational crops. So that if you have things, they grow in some of our areas, they can grow and harvest a crop in 22 days, like baby lettuce and things like that. So that's you really need high frequency information at least every month. And then most of this data, the gaps is most of this data is either missing, not all is collected regularly or available to everyone, and that includes land use and ownership type parcel maps, things like that. Crop data is one of the biggest gaps. The accuracy estimates of land surface elevations. You know, we hope that we have LIDAR, which is between a quarter and a meter in accuracy, depending on how it's done, and climate data and bias corrected downscale data spanning the border is problematic. We use several forms of downscaling here, and I don't think that there's comparable downscaling for what we would need on the other side in Mexico. Well locations and that kind of information is a huge data gap, which was just mentioned also by Laura. And surface water diversions, locations, types of diversion. So there's some of this is land-based data that's a data gap, but some of it is remote sensing data and how that can be integrated and whatnot. So those are some of the issues that we've seen in as far as that and lessons learned. But I think that the models have to be transboundary as much as possible. Next slide, please. And for us, what we're doing is that we're actually creating these small water accounting units, and they can actually come and go depending on change in ownership of the land and who's supplying what land with what wells and whatnot. So it can be all very, very, very dynamic in that sense. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to remind everybody that, you know, conjunctive use is what we're really trying to do, and remotely sensed data is a part of all that, and that we're hoping that groundwater sustainability equals strawberry fields forever. These are strawberry fields from Monterey. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Randy, for your contribution. This was the last question from us to you. Now we can go to the Q&A session. I know some of you are going to have to leave. We are past the hour, but again, we will be happy to stay with whoever that wants to stay. So I'm going to go ahead with some of the questions. Let me see. So I have a question for Laura that says, any idea on the age of the water in this groundwater system? Oh, wait, you did answer that one on, I'm sorry, like the chat. Okay, so Laura is simplifying the work for us. She is putting the answer on the chat. So I get, you answer those. Thank you. So I'm gonna go to-
We didn't know the age of the water there. We did a monthly basis, so we couldn't know the age of the water, but we think it's young because it's a quaternary aquifer and unconfined, so maybe days, months, tops.
Okay.
It's not going to be very old.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I do have a comment here from Alfonso Rivera. It says that the anthropogenic stresses to aquifers and watersheds represent very large data gaps. So remote sensing can indeed support hydrological and hydrogeological studies by assessing some of these parameters, but they cannot measure the stresses the systems go through. Pumping and and surface water extraction. For those type of stresses, we have no choice but to go to the field and measure them. So I'm pretty sure we agree on this, but I would like to see if you have additional comments for this.
I would just say real briefly that I totally agree with Alfonso.
Mhm.
But unlike most traditional groundwater models, we would want to measure the pumping and the surface water extractions, but we use them as observations to train the model so that it can be used in the future. But yeah, having that kind of historical, we call those higher order observations because they're rates and not just states of the system, and so they're very important.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Randy, for your contribution. So a question for Randy and Laura. Have you used remote sensing to, it says, estimate the evolution of the ecosystems and to get a difference between the impact of the climate change that is caused by human action?
I haven't done studies on that before, but I've seen some other studies and they usually focus on land use change. That's what I understand, but I don't really know because you can compare with remote sensors, the change, if it was before a forest and now it's a crop, you can identify those things in when you compare remote sensors of land use, but I haven't seen how you can relate that to climate change. There must be a way, but I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, well, I'm pretty sure there has to be a way. Oh, Randy, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to briefly say we looked a little bit at that when we did our future projections for the Central Valley with the A2 scenario in the CMIP 4. They also did some analysis of that for the San Joaquin Valley where they actually looked at they did a very detailed crop model that had changes. So when they were changing land use, swapping out urban for ag, or excuse me, ag for urban, and also then seeing the effects of the additional CO2 and how that would reduce ET, actually reduces ET. But whether that's offset by the minimum temperature raising ET overall is another question. But it's been looked at by some people in different settings like that. That's a good way to go, though. You can really get a better handle on it spatially as well as temporally.
Perfect. Thank you, Randy. We do have another question for you. That is, what is the difference between an integrated hydrological model and a groundwater flow model, which has a proper calculations of the recharge for each time step?
That's a great question, and the answer is pretty simple. A groundwater flow model has one flow equation for the flow in the groundwater. It has specified flows that are boundary conditions that are simulated for rivers and other things like that can be boundary conditions, but they're all boundary conditions with respect to the groundwater flow equation. An integrated hydrologic model is actually simulating multiple flow equations. So there can be a surface water flow equation, there can be a land use of water on the land coming and going from the land surface flow equation, which is what we do. So you have multiple flow equations. Now some are fully integrated and some are iteratively integrated. So some solve those equations separately and then iterate between them until they get a model solution, and others actually throw all that stuff into the A matrix and actually solve for all of it all at once, which makes them non-symmetric matrices and all kinds of other issues. But those are the main differences. And so we're an iteratively integrated hydrologic model.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. And another question for you. Do the model consider carbon layers, mines, and the continuity of calcium layers across the border? Does it consider coal layer faults that limit the aquifer connectivity with the river?
Yeah, that's for
It
me.
was for Laura. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I get it now with the coal and the
Yeah,
mine
that
layers.
was for me. Well, in Piedras Negras, in the southern portion and on the west, you can have some coal layers, but those are from almost formation. It's a Cretaceous formation, an older one. And you can have limestones on the north and also below the Quaternary Aquifer. We wanted to include flows from the limestones, but we didn't have the quantity of the flows to include them in the model. So we know they are happening, but we don't know how much. And we know that for geochemical analysis. Also near the coal mantles, we can have some sulfate waters, but those are waters that move through. There is cross-formational flow from almost formation also to our aquifer, and that's where we can find sulfates because of that kind of interaction. But again, we couldn't include because we didn't have the amounts of water. Also, in general, in the model, we just did flows. We didn't do anything about geochemistry, but I was reading some literature about it, and that's what I found.
Thank you, Laura. We do have, I think, a final question for Saul. Considering limitations that remote sensing data at high spatial resolution, you have proved that with this limitation, we can have good results. So what type of remote sensing information would you need to improve the modeling effort?
That is a very interesting question because normally when we try to calibrate the model, we use a metric, a numeric value to see how well it adjusts, what the errors are. But what we see is when we use different sources of information, these metrics do not always increase. Sometimes the models show us the proper metrics, but it's better to use a model that reduces the different characteristics of the hydrologic cycle in the most reliable way. So different information sources can be used. I don't know how many, but first we should evaluate the results to see how reliable the information is. But at the end of the day, what we need and what we're seeking is to obtain the best models with the available information.
Yeah,
Can I jump in, Gabby, really quick?
okay, yeah.
Just to complement, to try to I'm sorry. It's just I didn't have time to chat, to send it in the chat. So
Don't worry.
Saul, so what would you say is, what is the limit? How can we, perdón, Sam, should I do it, Saul, should I do it in English or in Spanish? I'm gonna do it in English and then you can answer in Spanish. So what is that limit? How can we say this is the least amount of data that I can work with to have a reliable model? I mean, what are the criteria? What are your thoughts? Or I guess that's the big question, right? I just want to get your thoughts out of it.
That is a very big question and a complicated one, as you say. But, as I've said, we try to generate the best models with the information available. And sometimes that means working with the little information available. We're talking about a hydrological plan where we may have at least 10 years in order to get some characteristics of a basin or a watershed to get, or of a more complex system like an aquifer. So But sometimes we have a 2-year period, or we have a discontinuity of data, and we have to just do our magic and juggle the data. And the wonderful thing about this remote sensing is that in spite of the lack of data in some processes, this helps us to see what the system behavior is, and in order for our model to best show the true system behavior.
Are you satisfied, Judge Rosario?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I just said for now, I'm satisfied for now. We can talk about this later.
Well done then. Well, that was our last question. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you so much for your patience and your participation. Thank you to the speakers. You were excellent. We want to remind the purpose of this program is to highlight your work as a scientist along the US-Mexico border in terms of technical advancement, implications for national collaboration, and of course, the lessons we have to address as a community. So thank you a lot for being here.
All right.
Yeah, also one last thing, una última comentario. Please do
And
remember that if
one
you are
more comment.
please do remember that if you are interested in a given topic, or you have something that you want to share, please do contact us. We are open for giving you or to put this forum at your service. Si alguno de ustedes tiene algo que quiera compartir, por favor, mándenos un mensaje y con nosotros con mucho gusto.
Please send us messages if you have anything you'd like to share. We're very interested.
Okay. Well, thanks again for being here. Don't forget that water unites us, and we will see you soon to talk
about science. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Gracias a